All right, so welcome to our free LSAT prep hour for September 13th, 2020. Today is going to be a part two, although it works as a standalone. It's going to be part two of my LSAT Speed Strategies workshop. Both of these will be on YouTube for you to watch later on. So this is specifically focused on reading comp. So I want to talk briefly over the general idea of the speed strategies that I've been pushing that I'll go through in more detail in that other video. And want to make sure that we're applying all these principles to RC with the idea of getting not just faster in general, not faster for its own sake, but more efficient and giving more room to spend where it's needed. A lot of this is just about where you allocate your effort. So these are the general principles that I've been pushing for speed strategies across the test. The last one I have in parentheses here because we're not going to do a lot of conditional logic on reading comp. Thankfully, we've got enough on our plate. That doesn't mean that getting used to conditional logic and getting strong with conditional logic wouldn't ever help. I think there are cases where we can understand the kind of statements they're making, or we can better, say, strengthen the author's perspective or something like that if we do have some comfort with conditional logic. But RC is certainly the place where that shows up the least, and so we're not going to emphasize that today. But I do want to emphasize the other four strategies or four mindsets, you might say: front-loading your efforts, making good predictions, recognizing bad answers, and avoiding unneeded work. And there's a lot of overlap between these areas. So let me talk a little bit about what I mean on these. I put this up here. So basic idea would be something like this. First strategy being front-loading your efforts. So partly that means when you're reading is that you're reading through a lens. You have a specific focus that you're using. And that initially the lens is always the same. I think a lot of people get really intimidated by certain types of passage. Oh, I really don't like, science passages or history passages, or heaven forbid, I don't even like law passages, whatever it is, right? But there's a certain type that people are thrown by. But the thing is that whether you're reading about a scientific theory or a type of literature, the same general idea applies. So what are we trying to get out of the passage? When I read a passage for the first time, what am I trying to achieve? Any ideas? Yeah, just go ahead and type it into the chat. Main point, okay. Passage structure, understanding of the main points. Yeah, right? We don't need to understand it all, and we shouldn't try. If you're really good at this, you might find that while you're reading quickly for structure and point, you also understand a whole lot of the details, in which case, awesome, more power to you, right? Just think, if you were the ultimate reading comp master, maybe you could read the entire passage incredibly quickly and you have perfect recall of all the details and you can answer any question anyone asked you about the passage. That would be beautiful, but that's not what most of us are able to do, and I would certainly include myself there. I can't do that. At my best, I feel like I'm getting close to that ideal, but it's hard. It's hard to do all that. And so if we have to choose, we want to focus on the big picture and less on the details. One problem is that we end up spending too long trying to master all the details. The other problem is that it can actively get in our way. There's that expression, you can't see the forest for the trees, right? The idea that I'm so focused on the specifics of how this metabolic process works, or the different kinds of neurotransmitters or cellular receptors or something like that, that I don't get the broad point of what the author's trying to say, and that's a real shame. So that's a general lens I'm trying to read to. I can also add a more specific lens once I know where the author is going, right? So to do that, what I try to do is I try to lean on the opening sentences. This applies at multiple levels. This applies certainly to the passage as a whole, like the initial sentences are probably more important to your understanding than the later sentences in the entire passage, but also within a paragraph. If I had to choose just a few sentences to read, I would probably pick the initial sentences of each paragraph. And then in some cases, the last sentence is very helpful. It's not uncommon, actually, that the main point is right at that juncture between the first and second paragraphs. So they might make the main point at the very end of the first paragraph or the very beginning of the second. But I'm slowing down early and I'm speeding up later. And very specifically, I'm speeding up when I know what I have. In other words, if I understand that the author is showing several advantages of a new method, or the author is explaining why we had to test this theory again, or the author is showing how one model of multicultural education was supplanted by a new and improved model of multicultural education. If I understand what they're doing, then I can speed up and go, yeah. In other words, if they're giving me examples and I know what the examples are of, I can rush through those examples. right? If they're listing several benefits of an approach, I can rush through those benefits because I already know what they are. They're examples, they're benefits, and I know what they're doing in the passage. So that's what I mean by speed up when you know what you have. And so the idea would be that when I'm reading the passage, I don't read at one uniform pace. At the beginning, especially the very first paragraph, very first few sentences, I'm often slowing down and trying to understand, what is this saying? Where's this going? How's this connected? What's their point? Sometimes they're nice enough to start with a clear thesis statement. They'll just flat out say, all human endeavors can be categorized in one of three ways. And you're like, okay, what are those categories? Great, you've got it laid out for me. Other times the first sentence might be more of a distraction. They'll start with some general statement or some kind of truism, and you're saying, all right, so where are you going with this? So if the first sentence simply says, be careful what you wish for, and you're going, okay, so what did someone wish for and what happened? And maybe it's a much more specific case that they're going to be getting into. Okay. Questions on that? Does that make sense as far as approach? And we'll look at this in practice in a minute. The other thing is we want to get very good at making predictions. And this, again, happens at multiple levels. If you're familiar with the idea of a fractal, there's the idea that things repeat at different levels, right? So if you're looking at, say a bit of coastline and it kind of looks rugged like this, right? And then maybe you zoom in on a piece of the coastline and it looks like that inside, right? And then you zoom in further and it keeps on doing that same kind of wiggly thing all the way down. There can be a bit of a fractal element to how we front load our effort and how we work on prediction, because I could say, all right, I want to spend more time understanding the passage than getting lost in a question. And I want to spend more time at the first paragraph than in the rest of the paragraphs. And within the first paragraph, I might want to spend more time at the beginning of that first paragraph than at the end. Same thing when I do a question. I might spend more time understanding the question and predicting an answer than I spend in the answer choices. Well, the same thing can happen with predictions. I'm predicting as I read, and then when I'm getting to questions, I'm predicting as I go for, into the answer choices. So it's at multiple levels that this shows up. So what am I doing with making good predictions? First off, I want to predict while I read. If the author presents a dilemma, if I'm paying attention, I can say, oh, they're probably going to try to resolve that dilemma. Or if they say something like, until 1950, everybody believed this, you could predict, okay, what happened around 1950 that made everyone change their mind? You're looking for that. And a lot of times people don't see a particular part of the passage coming because they weren't predicting. So just the way you might predict when you're watching a movie, right? You might predict when you're reading a book or you're listening to your friend tell a story, right? I was looking everywhere for my phone. I was looking everywhere for my phone. Let me guess, it was right in your pocket, or your glasses were on your head, right? You see certain things coming. It doesn't even matter if you're right or wrong to some extent. It matters that you're trying to predict because it keeps you engaged in the passage. It keeps you thinking. But also when your predictions are met, then it speeds up your comprehension. You're like, oh yeah, that's what I thought, right? That's what I thought you were going to say. That's what I thought was going to happen. Okay. Really importantly, when we're doing questions, we should expect the answers to be predictable. I think this one thing is probably one of the single biggest differences between sort of an amateur test taker and someone who's really good, is the folks who are just kind of flying through this haphazardly are just sort of looking at the answer saying, what looks good today? And the folks who really have this down to a science where they don't miss many are predicting the answers, and they know the right answer when they see it because they already knew it was coming. Now, that's not always going to happen. And certainly in the material we'll look at today, there will be cases where I didn't see the answer coming, and maybe you will, but maybe you won't see it either. Sometimes there are answers that are almost impossible to predict. But that's why I say expect most of them to be predictable. Lean in that direction. Figure that the majority of the time, you're going to at least have an idea of what you're looking for, even if you don't know exactly. And the same thing is true with, say, logical reasoning. I may not know exactly why the plan is flawed, but I have the general idea. They're assuming that nothing will go wrong in this step or this step, right? And so an answer that weakens it might just show a thing that goes wrong. I also want to get really good at recognizing bad answers. There can be bad answers that are just invariably bad. They're just too extreme to ever be true, right? Imagine an answer choice that said something like, Dmitry is the best person ever. Well, thank you. But how would you ever prove that? How could anyone even know that I'm the best person ever? What does it mean, the best person ever? How could that be a right answer? I suppose it's possible if the question were for the author's opinion. Maybe the author said I was the best person ever, but that's fairly unlikely. And so we're looking out for things that either can't be true or seem very unlikely to be true. We can do that sometimes before we've even read the passage. And a useful exercise, if you've never tried it, is to go into a set of questions for a passage you haven't read and try to knock out some answers. And we're going to do that in a moment for a particular question. But specifically, we want to watch out for extremes. Extremes can be right. It could be that the author thinks that, Louis Armstrong is the most successful musician of all time, or that, this kind of poetry is better than all others. They could think that, but they tend not to be that incautious. And then we want to be completely able to cut unreasonable answers. One's like saying Dmitry's the best person. Just how could that be? What would that mean? So get rid of answers that simply don't make sense, that can't be. And this you can sometimes see even when you haven't read the passage or haven't understood the passage very well. We want to make sure to stick to the scope, stick to the mission of what we're talking about, right? If I'm trying to help you do better at the LSAT, that doesn't have anything to do with whether I think you should go to law school after all, or which law school is the best, or which kind of law you should practice, right? That's not the scope of my work. That's not the scope of what you're asking me for, right? Whereas if you did ask me that, then it would not make much sense for me to start talking about the LSAT, right? So we have to make sure we're answering the question that's being asked. That's very specific to what we're seeing, but it's very, very important. That's one of the most common sources of error, is that people, without realizing it maybe, are just answering a different question that was asked. Getting back to the idea of extremes, we want to know when to appreciate extremes. And there can be cases, if I'm trying to say strengthen or weaken an argument, things like that, where I might be okay with extremes. So it depends on whether I'm dealing with sort of a broad approach, like a main point, author opinion, or whether I'm talking about something like strengthening a weakening or perspective, which you still have in reading comp, right? Okay. And then when you see abstract language, make sure that you're recognizing when they say, for instance, the author recognizes the merits of a particular approach, but prefers a more fundamental approach. And like, well, what's the approach and what's the more fundamental one? Actually fill those in with specific things from the passage. Oh, the approach that they think is, has some merit is, the one in paragraph 3, but the more fundamental approach is the one that was at the beginning of the passage the author ends up favoring. So fill that kind of stuff in. So let's just take an interlude, since it's been a lot of me talking, to just try a question where we can get rid of some extremes, right? And obviously, if you haven't read this passage, you're not going to have a great sense of what the right answer must be. And that's not the goal. It's rather to just say, what are the answers that seem more likely and less likely? So I want you to take about a minute. And so I'll just be quiet and let you read for about a minute and see, just based on this question alone, without any information, what answers seem more likely and what answers seem less likely. And then we'll discuss. So take a moment to do that. All right, so what do we think? Presumably not having read this passage, unless you happen to know this one. This is from Prep Test 65. If you've done it, if you want to look it up later, you can. So I'm seeing B is a bit too extreme. Yes, and a couple things to notice. One is as much as possible. That's always tricky, right? So if I say, you know, you need a lot of vitamin D or you need to get your sleep, right? That's quite a big difference between saying get as much vitamin D or as much sleep as possible. Hey, maybe there's an upper limit. So you have to watch out for anything that says max this out. Okay, good. Another piece about this is should be. There's nothing wrong with the author thinking something should be. It doesn't make B wrong. But so maybe I should just underline rather than cross that. It doesn't make B wrong by itself. But I have to be careful about what we call normative statements, statements that tell you what you ought to do, because there's a big difference between what the author is maybe suggesting or saying is workable or they like versus saying this is what we should do, period. Right. And then, yeah, there's another piece, right? It says there is no way to predict, right? And notice that they're not just saying that we don't seem very good at predicting or that it's difficult to predict. They're saying there's no way to predict, which implies that not only aren't we doing it successfully, but that no one could, right? So what if I said, hey, don't worry about trying to time the stock market because there's no way to predict when it'll go up or down. Well, maybe I'm not good at predicting it. Maybe most people aren't, right? But there might be a way. Maybe someone who knows more than I do can figure that out, right? So we've got a lot of reasons to cross off B. It's very, very strongly worded statement that doesn't automatically make B wrong, although spoiler, it is wrong. But there's lots of reasons to be suspicious of this. It's like if you ever get a sales pitch that just seems too much. Only our product will give you this thing, and once you have it, and you're like, is it really? If this product were this magical, why wouldn't everyone be using it, right? If there's really some pill I could take where I would look like I'm 25 until I'm 100 or something like that, why isn't everyone walking around looking 25, right? Something's going on. Okay. What else did you cut? Liz says A. What's wrong with A? It will not provide is a very strong statement. Now, it sure would help if we read the passage where they talk about this. In some ways, A kind of goes against the specific point the author is making in the passage, but we don't need to know that now. One thing that's really interesting, if we bring in a little bit of real world knowledge, is we say, really? Future electronic systems won't improve at all? Like they're basically saying technology is maxed out. When do those predictions ever turn out to be true, right? So again, that's bringing a little bit of real world. But since we know that the passage is going to be talking about something, did they really suggest that technology has maxed out? That seems pretty unlikely, right? So yeah, so will not provide any kind of goes together, right? As sort of one thing. There it means zero, none, right? Okay. Anything else that you might be suspicious of? C, what's up with C? Yeah, misled's a very strong word, right? Now it's tricky. That might be true. Sometimes you definitely see cases where, a manufacturer or a lawmaker or whatever has misled the public. These things happen, right? I won't name any names. Bunch of lawyers around. No, but it's certainly possible. We need to see very specific proof, not just that people misunderstood, but they had been actively misled. So it's suggesting active misdeeds, which is certainly possible, but it's a stronger statement than just saying they're wrong. And so I might be like, they cross that out. Just curious, I'm going to run a little poll right now. If you had to choose D or E right now, which one do you choose? So I just threw in a poll. It's got all 5 choices, but unless you take exception to one of our eliminations, I would choose D or E. Obviously, it would sure help to have the passage, wouldn't it? Okay. Anyone want to defend their choice? If you chose D over E, what led you to that choice? Why might we favor D over E? Value judgments is vague. And Carolyn, is vague bad? Like if I want to get the author's opinion, is it a liability for them to be vague? Now, in fact, if we're avoiding extremes, vague is my friend. Now, that doesn't automatically make E the answer, of course. You can't just say anything vague and it's true. But the vaguer a statement is, the harder it is to disprove. The harder it is to really say it's wrong. Imagine if I said something like this. I think something may have happened once or twice that maybe wasn't appreciated fully by everyone to whom it happened. That's kind of vague. What are you talking about, right? But wait, has something ever happened that someone maybe didn't approve of fully or appreciate? Well, obviously, many times, right? You could fill a lot more in than that. And if I have a really strong opinion, let's say I think, this plan is bad, then you could also infer that I think that this isn't the perfect plan, that there may be some flaws in the plan. So vague, mild, weak, cloudy, elliptical kind of language is actually really good. It's like a politician who doesn't want to commit, and they, what's my policy on the environment? My policy is that we hope we can enjoy the environment for years to come. I mean, that's, I guess, slightly pro-protection, sort of, but what does it mean? Maybe I don't want to pass any actual laws about it, right? What's my stance on education? I think the children are the future, and I want the children to learn. That's not very, committing too much, right? And that makes it actually a good answer for our purpose, because it's hard to say that would be wrong. Okay. Now, another objection someone's making to E is stating what will happen. And we do have to be careful when they say something will happen, they're being fairly definitive, right? So when they're asking for the author's view, it does not have to be specific at all. It could be anything the author would agree with, right? And this is true in general when you're trying to infer something, whether it's the author's opinion or a fact. So when they ask what does a passage strongly suggest, we're trying to infer something. Weak or random or kind of non-central things can be just fine. For instance, you can infer from this passage that some LSAT teachers have framed pictures, right? It is not a central part of our discussion today. Cool as the goat and my daughter and the puppy are, but it is still true. And so we don't necessarily have to have something that's central, and we don't have to have something that's super detailed when we're answering these questions. If we have a main point, then we have to be very clear on what the actual point is. But here, it's just anything the author might agree with. Okay. What about folks who like E? How did you settle on E? Oh yeah, that's really interesting, right? The idea that if you bring in some real world for a second, if you know what an archivist is, it's someone who maintains archives, who collects things. It seems like that would be a central concern of archivists, right? So I'm bringing in a little bit of an idea of what that word means, right? Fair game, right? It seems like if you're running an archive, whether you're working in ancient Alexandria or whether you're working today with some digital archive, that deciding what to save seems like kind of the top of your job description. So it seems a little odd that would only be a recent thing. If anything, you might expect it to go the other way, right? That when I had limited space on my shelf for music, because I had records or CDs, right? Then I might have to really decide what I want to keep. Whereas if I could just store all my digital music on a hard drive, I can have everything. I don't have to throw anything out, right? I never have to trash any music, right? So E's a little more open-ended. It seems a little safer. It would be like if I said, hey, you know what I think you're going to see? I don't know exactly how the election's going to go, but I think you will see that some voters will make decisions that we didn't predict. And some people might win in some districts where the polls said they might lose, right? Well, sure, that tends to happen. It's a specific prediction, but it's a wide open enough prediction that's going to happen somewhere, right? Even if 95% of the polls turn out to be correct, if there's one, House election in Georgia where the underdog won, then I was right. So it's pretty safe to do. So the answer ends up being E. I'm not saying you should have gotten that and all the others are clearly wrong. We're playing a game here because we haven't read the passage. But I think the point about D is, this has only recently become a concern for archivists, is a little strange. And that might make us get rid of D. If we dig into the passage, obviously you could find very specific justification for E. Okay. Questions on that? Okay. I want to get back to our set of general principles, and then we'll try applying them in reading through some material. So we have our first three principles here. One more principle that I would use: avoid unneeded work. So what am I looking for here? Look, I don't want to be lazy, although sometimes I use the word lazy in a positive way. I'm trying to be a little lazy on the test, productively lazy. But I want to be efficient, and I don't want to do work I have to do. Think about it in school, where often, you'll read a 500-page novel, but then all you have to do to prove that you read it is take a quiz. Or, you have a bunch of chapters of your chemistry textbook to read, and then they test you on very specific concepts from the book, and it's open book. So maybe you could have avoided reading some of that. But in school, at least the idea is you're supposed to be doing it for the knowledge, the learning. You're supposed to read the entire novel. That's the main point, right? You're supposed to learn all the chemistry, and they're just quizzing you to see if you did it, right? And although you certainly, if you're in a hurry, might skip some of the tasks and just be efficient and focus on getting the grade, at least the idea, we might all agree, is it would be great if everyone learned all the content in their classes. But on the LSAT, we're not trying to learn the material. I'm not reading this passage to learn all about archivists. I'm reading this passage to show that I already know how to read and to get points on the LSAT so I can go to law school, right? I'm not doing it for its own sake. And so I want to save some effort. So a couple of things there. If I'm not sure about something, move on. If I'm looking at B going, do I know that? Let me come back to it. And don't feel bad doing that. That's why we like to use the word defer, because it makes it feel active instead of, I don't know if A is right. Oh, well, I guess I'm not smart. Instead, I'm actively choosing not to try to decide. I don't have to decide for all time whether something's right or wrong. I have the option on the digital test to actually mark digital items off and click them to cross them out. But I don't have to do that too aggressively. If I'm not sure, I can leave it. That can be about a section of text. It can be about an answer in the answer choices. If something's wasting my time, I should guess. I don't generally want to skip an entire reading comp passage, especially if I'm trying to do fairly well. But that doesn't mean that an individual question might not be wasting my time. Maybe I'm going round and round trying to find some very specific details. Maybe it's like one of those dual passages, and then they say, each of the following is mentioned by both passages except. And so to get this right, in theory, you have to say, okay, this was mentioned on line 12 here and line 40 over here, and this was mentioned here, and this was mentioned here, and finally find one that's mentioned in passage 1, but not passage 2. It's a lot of work. So if I don't have time, I should guess. If I have time to go back and fix it, that's great. If I'm fine on time, I might go ahead. But if I'm getting my time burned up, I don't want to do it. And then really importantly, I don't want to try to understand everything. Again, the better you are at this and the better you are at that specific passage, if it's a subject matter you're comfortable with, the more likely you might feel that you do understand everything. And it's wonderful. There's nothing wrong in theory with understanding everything. But when we try to do it, when we try to get every point, often we miss out. And so be ready to let things go, whether that's specific details that we don't need when we're reading, or when we're getting into the answer choices, very specific parts of an answer choice that I can already rule out. If the author says, if one of the answers says, the author hates this approach because of blah, 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 and we know they don't hate the approach, then we don't need to understand what the other part says, right? We can just get rid of that and not have to waste our time in it. So we're not trying to think about and do every single concept we're presented with. Just like on a logic game, if I know that M can go on Tuesday, then I don't need to prove why these other things can't happen, because I already know that I have one that works. I got a question. Do I pre-phrase main point questions? Absolutely. Absolutely. I think if you're not pre-phrasing main point questions, you're just setting yourself up for trouble. I can't see any reason not to pre-phrase them, and I see a lot of reason to do so. And that gets back to front-loading your works. Expect most answers to be predictable, and one of the most predictable types you'll see is the main point question. Now, there are problems, and I'll show you a couple examples in a minute of main point questions, one of which is a bit more predictable than the other. And so certainly there is some variation in how we think about main point questions. And there might be some levels of specificity we weren't expecting. Sometimes it's pretty obvious. Oh, the author's main point is that we should follow this new approach, or that, X is better than Y, or that, maybe it's a causal type argument. They think that this is the reason that we see this in our immune system, whatever, right? And sometimes that's just easy to predict and we see it. Other times there's levels of detail that we weren't thinking about, and some of the answers start to look very similar. How many of you have had that situation? You can raise your hand you hit the hand raise for this if you're with me on this. How many have you gotten down to two that just don't seem distinguishable? So just click the hand raise if you've had this, where you're like, these seem to be saying the same thing to me. Yeah, almost everyone raised their hand, right? Yeah, me too, right? It's really, really common. Sometimes that's a conditional logic thing. I'll see two statements that actually I realize one's actually the reversal of the other, and I need to see the direction. Sometimes there's a little difference. One says that something is, influenced, and the other says it's heavily influenced. And do we have the justification for the word heavily, or something like that? Sometimes though, it's just a matter of finding, where that detail is and what we know, what specific word is justified. And so part of that is getting fast enough at getting rid of the others that I have time. Look at the last question we did. We all agreed to get rid of A, B, and C, and then we had a little more time to think about D versus E. Obviously, we would have read the passage. And so getting really comfortable doing that on the test is really important, and that gets back to front-loading your efforts. If I understand what the main point is in broad terms, and if I understand that some answers definitely don't represent the main point, then I have a little bit of breathing room to stop and compare, B and C or whatever it is. Whereas if I'm sitting there going, oh gosh, what's the main point? I have no idea. Then that's going to be a real mess when I go into the answer choices, because oh, is it that, or and what about, is that word in there? And then sometimes I end up getting back to the idea of sticking to your scope. Is you want to make sure you're answering the question that was asked. And sometimes in the main point, I see this all the time, people accidentally, without realizing it, pivot and answer a different question, like, is this thing true? Is this thing there? And so they'll end up choosing an answer that is definitely there. They'll say, oh, look, line 25, it says that. Yeah, but was that the main point? Oh, yikes, no, that was a very specific point. So the more I've got a sense of what I'm looking for, the easier that part gets. So let's try putting this together. I want to do some front loading on the reading. So let's look at a passage together in pieces. Okay, so I'm going to actually do the passage with you that we just did a question from. Later on, if you want to pull this up, you have your citation here. It's Prep Test 65, Section 3, second passage. But for right now, I just want to read it a piece at a time. So take a moment just to read the first paragraph and nothing else. I'm actually going to cover up the rest of it. And then let's discuss when you've done that. So take a moment to just read the first paragraph. Okay. How are you feeling at this? Did that give us enough time? So let's look at what front loading looks like in this context. So they start with an assertion, right? While recent decades have seen more information recorded than any other era, the potential for losing this information is now greater than ever. Huh. That sounds kind of like a opinion or thesis statement. I don't know at this point if that's the main point, but it seems pretty important. Now, notice that they narrow it down. This prospect is of great concern to archivists who are charged with preserving vital records and documents indefinitely. Okay. So they're talking about the potential for losing information. And then they're specifically talking about this is being of great concern to archivists. Okay. And why are we concerned with losing information? What's happening? Why might we lose information? What's the general point they're making here? Huh. All right. The quality or the durability, right? So we have less durable stuff, right? Yeah. That's tricky. Obviously, it could feel the other way around. It could feel like, oh, I'm constantly losing papers or they can catch fire, whereas, my emails are stored safely in the cloud. But it's a tricky thing, right? You could also wipe out, a million emails really fast if the computer gets taken out, right? So it's a different kind of durability, but they're saying specifically that it's less. They're not debating it. So notice that we talked about speed up when you know when you have. When I get to the second half, I can zip through much faster. Can we see that? Because once I get the idea that, okay, the quantity has gone up, but the durability has decreased, right? They're saying, hey, we're getting all this information, but it doesn't last as well. And so, okay, got it. Clay tablets, black and white photographs, color photographs, videotapes, right? Who's heard of those anymore, right? So we don't really need these examples. Those aren't really, I don't want to say they're not the point at all. They're helping illustrate the point really well, but we don't really need them, especially if we already understand. And so I can speed up a lot and save myself time, and I can reinvest that somewhere else. Just the way I can, if I save money, I can invest it, and save it for my retirement, right? I can invest my time somewhere else. So what I want to really get at is, hey, there's a problem for archivists, right? More info and it's less durable. That's all I really need here. Agreed? We happy? All right, let's try some more. So I'm not even going to have you read quietly. Let's just look straight at what they do. Computer technology would seem to offer archivists an answer because you can transfer and store things electronically, occupying very little space. So notice we have a seeming solution, but see how important that phrase is, would seem, right? So we have a seeming solution. And so I don't even have to read it to know they're going to say, but there it is. And you can just call that, right? If someone says, hey, most people think this and this and this and this, you're waiting for them to say, but I know, right? The rest of us know this, right? Whatever it is, right? A political speech, the other party thinks this and this, well, clearly we know better, right? Whatever our party is, right? Okay. So what's the problem with the solution? So before it was we had a lot more info, but it was getting less and less durable, right? What's the problem now? What's the problem with just saying, hey, yay, computers. We don't have to worry about color photos becoming unstable, right? Right? But things keep changing faster, right? So there's this idea of obsolescence. I'm not that old and I already have files that I'll never see again because I just wouldn't know how to access them, right? I tried to write a novel when I was like 13 and there's just no way to access that information. And just good luck. You'd have to be a real computer geek to have the resources to unlock that, right? I'm not famous enough for anyone to put in that effort. Okay. So that's what we've got. And we could say, we could add some urgency. They're quickly running out of time. One interesting thing I should also mention, people tend to focus really heavily on the ends of things. And so it's just a bias that we can sometimes have that you can notice. A lot of times people say, oh, the main point is that, these things only last, or especially here, the main point is they're running out of time. Yeah, they're running out of time, but don't let that last line influence you too much. The basic idea is that just things keep changing faster and faster. So we haven't solved our problem. Okay, whoops. Let's look at our last paragraph. Notice we also have a very loaded phrase, even if, right? So saying, hey, even if we get better systems, right? What do we say now? So even if we fix this problem, decisions will have to be made quickly, let me let you read the rest of this on your own and see what stands out as important to you. So take a moment to finish reading this and we'll talk. Okay, so what's the last point they're making here? What is paragraph 3 adding to our understanding? Sheer volume, love the all caps. Yeah, there's just a ton of stuff, right? The last sentence, the sheer volume of accumulated records on non-durable media. What do they talk about? Papers, tablets, old stuff. It's gonna be hard to sort it all out. I've seen that about old movies too. They're like, look, yeah, we can, take old film prints and restore them and, store them on hard drives and all that. But there's so many old film prints from like 100 years ago and they're falling apart as we speak. So who's going to quickly do all that, right? How do we decide, right? Yeah, interestingly, the sheer volume is prohibitive. Yeah, right? So yeah, how do we know which things are important? And it gets back to our problem. It gets back to our answer choice that we crossed off. It's not only a recent problem that archivists have to decide what's important. That's always been an issue, right? Okay, so so what we've got is, although you can see how someone might use this to justify that answer of D that we had. So so even if we solve the storage problem, there's too much stuff, right? How do we prioritize? Okay, so we can have a general structure to this that says, all right, we said, tons of info falling apart more rapidly, right? It's lasting less long. Storage is tough, right? Change, obsolescence are happening. And then in any case, too much, right? Have to choose, right? Your notes might look very different from mine, but we want to get to that general idea that this is all we really need. There's more to understand here. But there's all this, think about all the things we didn't really get into. The clay tablets, the 1980s with acidic paper, optical, they mentioned the 1980s twice, we never discussed it. Computer disks, specific lengths of time, the works of Plato and Homer and Virgil. There's all this stuff, right? It's the kind of stuff that gets mentioned. If you'll see an author try to do a book tour and they're talking about their book, they might just say, what's your book about? Oh, my book has vampires and time travels and cuddly kittens and, poisonous tea. And it's just like, oh, that sounds interesting. I like those things. Oh, right. But that's not the point necessarily of their book. What's their point? Does it have a main through line, a thesis, an emphasis, right? And that's what we're really trying to get, not all that kind of, well, clutter, as we were saying. So that allows us to put this together into a main point, right? So take your stab at how you'd phrase a main point. Try typing that in. What would you say overall in one sentence the main point is? What would be a good way to sum that up? say something like, it's tough to archive stuff, right? Could be a very short version of this, right? We're losing data and have to make choices, right? Something like that. Yeah, the amount of info stored is disappearing rapidly. The ways to sort this info is extensive. We won't be able to archive all this info. Great, yeah. So you can make it short, you can make it long, but you want to get to the general idea, right? So let me have you do a main point question on this. We've had our prediction. Let's see what matches. Pull this in when you've got it. If you're doing it at home, take a moment to try this one out before we discuss. Here we go. All right, so reviewing our principles just briefly before we dig into the answers. So we already talked about making a prediction for this particular question. We want to watch out for things that don't fit, and this can be a way to save time as we go through the answers. If we know that something is just nowhere close to the main point, if it's too specific, it seems to go the other way, then we don't have to worry about whether it's true or not. For instance, if we know that they're saying archivists have an easy job, then we can just cross that off, and we don't have to worry about the part that says why they have an easy job or what have you, right? And if we need to, we'll defer as we go through, right? If we're not sure about something. So if I look at, let me pull it back up. If I look at A, the increasing volume of information, okay, that sounds good. Being stored and decreasing durability of modern storage media, okay, are making it more and more difficult for archivists to carry out their charge. So let's talk about difficulty, increasing difficulty. This sounds like it's in keeping with what we talked about. So I would just hold on to it, right? It fits, nothing else. What is B saying? No one chose B. What's the problem with it? Yeah, it's a positive thing, right? It's way too positive. They're making the situation look all grim, and this is saying, you know, just kind of cutting through it. It's saying modern techniques have enabled archivists to distinguish with greater efficiency, right? No, they don't seem to be doing better. They seem to be having a hard time, right? That's out. Okay. C is interesting because it's talking about how conventional storage media are, you know, going to endure longer than electronic storage media. That may be true. We don't need to determine it. Seems true, but it's not our point, right? So we can get rid of it. It's just not the specific point that they're making. It's one thing that they talked about in passing, although I don't know if they said the archivists have come to believe it, right? What about D? What would you say to someone who made the case for D? He said, I thought the whole point was you have to make choices. What's wrong with D? Meanwhile, E is terrible, right? It's super positive, but then judgy at the end, right? So neither of those parts is very good. First, it's saying, hey, we can get everything. And second, there's a bunch of junk. This is more like what we know about real life. Yeah, because, you know, YouTube can have everything on here. My beautiful LSAT lessons and, you know, someone else's junky you know, whatever they put up are both on there. I was going to do something funny about someone's beautiful cello playing or something, but okay. So it's not about what we particularly as archivists value, right? That's not the main thing they're talking about. It might, if we look back, it might be there, right? It's let's see, you know, these decisions should be informed by an assessment of the value of each document. There is there, you know, whether they mean value like monetary or, you know, in terms of knowledge, right? Can anyone see this as an extreme answer? Well, I mean, that's tricky because they might believe it to have societal value, right? It's not saying like it's valuable for me, like I'm going to save the works of Plato because they help me in my life or something like that. I just might know that people like those, even if I don't, for instance, right? One thing to watch for, and this gets back to our missing principle that we didn't talk about, which is thinking conditionals. We have to watch out for onlys that show necessary conditions. So we are looking to see what's valuable, but that doesn't mean to save only what's of value, right? If you give me a hard drive with a bunch of stuff saved on it that's junk, I might say, yeah, I'll put that in the basement. That's fine, right? So we have to be careful that we're not overdoing it. So we don't know that we only want things that are believed to be of genuine value, right? And besides, it's also it's less about storage limitations than about the scope of your decisions, right? They're trying to understand what to choose. So their point is not that our hard drives aren't big enough to save stuff and we have to erase files, so much as it's, even if we get, you know, the perfect storage system, we have to figure out what to save before it's too late, right? And that gets back to the volume kind of decision. A really good question: would I have chosen A and moved on? Never, not unless I was about to run out of time. No, I would never suggest that you do that. Look at all 5 answer choices. You just might look at them a little faster, because here's the danger. Sure, this time A was right and those were wrong, and you could think it was a waste to go through. The problem is, in another one, A looks good and then easy answer. Oops, right? So you have to notice, since just about everyone in the room said, yeah, I've been in a situation where I've had to choose between 2 that look really, really similar, you have to expect that there might be another one that looks a lot like A. All right. I want to go a couple of minutes over the hour because I want to give you a chance to read another passage, which might seem like overkill, but right now I really want to push the speed. So I'm going to only give you 2 minutes to do the next passage, and I want you to focus on what you can skip. A couple questions before we do that. Let's see. So someone's asking, is it okay that A says that it's getting more and more difficult if we've never talked about the work of past archivists? Well, the trick is that they do talk about increasing trends, the exponential increase in the quantity of information, the decrease in the durability of the information, and the sheer volume that is now in place that we've had to deal with. And so since all of those trends are going in the wrong direction, then without knowing anything about past archivists, we can still say that in that sense, at least, they've had it easier than before. So we do get to do that. Should I read the question and answers before reading the passage? I would argue strenuously against it. Some people like to have a quick preview. First off, I just don't think you have time. Second, I don't think that fits our principle of doing only what's necessary and front-loading your efforts. If you're reading all the questions, you've got a mess of stuff in your head distracting you. What you want to know is, what's my main task? I want to know what's the author's point and where's the structure. And if I'm trying to think about, you know, which of the following is characteristic of this and what would weaken the perspective of Hoffman in line 29, that's just mental clutter that's getting in my way. So no, I would say definitely do not try to read the questions and answers before reading the passage. You're always going to want to have the general point. And question was about the conditional idea in D. It's not that conditional statements are wrong. It's that the only is an extreme by making a limitation, right? It's saying if you're preserving it, it must be something that we believe to have genuine value, where there might be cases where you'd preserve something even when it doesn't have genuine value. So it just relates to conditional reasoning. I'm not saying that because it has a conditional type statement, it is instantly wrong. Although it is true that conditional statements are extreme by definition. If A, then B, right? If I say all mammals nurse their young, that means if you're a mammal, you nurse your young. Well, what if you're a man? You're a male mammal. Oh, no, apparently you nurse your young. You're a mammal, it says. So extremes we have to watch in general. And so if we look at A, A is talking about a trend, but it's not saying if this, then that, absolutely. Okay, cool. So I just, like I said, want to take 2 minutes to read this next passage, and it'll be from the same prep test 65. So if you have access to that test, you might want to run through the questions that are there. But what I want you to do is try to read this. Actually, I'm not even going to give you a minute, 2 minutes. I'm going to give you like a minute 40. So get as far as you can in a minute 40. And when I say get as far as you can, get to the end. So what does that mean? You may have to skip some parts very aggressively. So partly what we want to think about is what can you skip and still get to the overall point. So I'm going to stop you in a minute and 40. Here we go. Okay, how do we do reading it that fast? Do you feel like you got to the end with any sense of the whole? Somewhat, yes. It's very fast, yeah. And it can vary a lot. Sometimes I have people who are able to go very fast on one passage with really strong understanding, and then another time they'll read it really, really fast, and then I'll have to say, no, you go back. And the trick is how do we know which one it is? What if we think we understood it and we're just wrong? And of course, that same thing happens with games. I think I have it all framed out and I know exactly what happens. And then I get to the first couple of questions and something's up. Something's not working. So we want to try to get there. A lot of you are saying you're able to do it in that time. It may depend on your comfort, obviously, with reading about this. But there's a lot that we could ignore, right? So what are some line ranges that you felt you could speed up in? Yeah, I don't need the names. No disrespect to these authors and their works, all of which I'm sure are wonderful. But I don't need to know the names of them right now to read the passage, right? So I can cut that. I know a genre came into prominence. I do want to have that, so I wouldn't cut 5, but I would cut afterwards. Yeah, a lot of paragraph 3. I might even be, if I were really in a hurry, you know what I might do? I might skip paragraph 3 entirely. I'm not saying that we should or that it's a bad paragraph, but we could skip a little bit there, right? So let's look at how this might go in real time, right? So we're getting in there, we're saying, all right, in the 1980s, there was a proliferation of poetry collections, short stories, and novels published by women of Latin American descent. Okay, fine. That's just a factual statement. There a bunch of women of Latin American descent were publishing literature. Okay. By the end of the decade, another genre, the autobiography, also came into prominence, right? Which sounds a little funny. I mean, obviously the autobiography wasn't invented in the 1980s, But maybe it was a new thing that a lot of Latin American women were getting to write their autobiographies. Okay, and we've got 3 notable collections. So the fact that these particular collections are there is not unimportant. Like, they're going to talk about those 3, and they get into details about them, right? So these parts are connected, right? They list what the works are, and then they go into detail about each one and why it's so notable. Sure, right? But when we're trying to get the main point, we can just say, all right, so there were some notable autobiographies. I wouldn't want to skip all of paragraph 2, and in fact, I might slow down here because I'm kind of, I don't know about you, but I'm a little bit sort of going, yeah, okay, autobiographies, heard of those, not very interesting by itself. The autobiographies may be wonderful, but why do I care that some people wrote their autobiographies? What are you trying to tell me? I knew that autobiographies existed. So what's new? And I'm waiting for that. These collections are innovative at many levels. I can speed up again if I want, but I might just kind of glance at what kinds of things they're innovative about, right? Traditional linguistic boundaries, a mix of English and Spanish, politics, cultural identities, interrelationships, gender, mixed structure, essays, sketches, short stories, poems, journal entries. All right, okay, so what am I getting at? I might read this slow, I might skip some, I might read this really carefully, different approaches in this. Some people said to skip this, some people didn't. But what I can get out of this is, oh, these are innovative books that do interesting things, and how interesting I find them or how important particular parts are to me may vary from person to person, right? Paragraph 3 just gets into what they do very specifically. So we can still look at it even though I cross it out. So she's presenting her personal history and the history of the Mexican American community. She's got a mix of genres, likewise characterized by a mix of genres, political, okay, departs even further. So even a word, a phrase like that can be really useful, because if you didn't already know, you could say, hey, these people are departing from conventions. Okay, if I hadn't already figured out, they're saying, hey, these people were kind of trailblazing. They were doing new things with autobiography. Then notice, if I hadn't already gotten that, they say it again here. They've revolutionized the genre of autobiography, expressing their own experiences, right? So maybe there were different needs for this community, right? So how that speaks to you, depending on who you are and what your experience is, thinking about these issues is going to be different. But the same idea can hold that, all right, these are people who made some changes in how things are written to better express their experience, and I can have something like that. Okay. How ready do you feel? Give yourself a grade of A through E. I'm going to put in the poll for it. A being the best. How ready do you feel to answer a main point question? All right. A through C, right? Liz is saying it's more digestible than some. Yeah, for sure. But notice that in some ways this is actually less digestible than the last one. The last one was only paragraph 2. I had little pieces of I think it was 4 in my last workshop from the same section. It's not too crazy. But again, that's going to depend from person to person and what their strengths are. Some people will end up really not liking the very first one. Okay, so let's see. I'll tell you. I think maybe you won't find it. So I think this is actually a particularly hard main point question. We're going to end on this. But see if you can get to the main point. Let's use some of our principles though, right? So we're going to defer if we're not sure, right? We're going to not dig into specific points right away. Maybe we're going to see something better later. So if you look at it and go, I like this part, but did they do that? Hold on, I won't cross that out yet, right? Get rid of the ones that seem impossible and then narrow down as needed. Okay, don't try to do it all at once. Let's give you the answers and I'll have you pull this in whenever you're ready. All right, if you're not sure, go ahead and put an answer in. I'll give you an example of one thing people do that sometimes is inadequate. It's what I call the noun approach. Sometimes when I ask what something's about, just like I was saying with the person whose novel was about kittens and tea and all that, right? I might just say something like, oh, it's about Latina autobiographies. Okay, cool, that's fine. But now I get in there and I'm like, huh, Latina writers, autobiography, Latina autobiographers, Latina autobiographers, Latina writers. I might get rid of, well, nope, there's autobiography, right? Latina authors, autobiography. So if I'm just looking for that, unfortunately, it's like one of those Google searches where you get too many hits that don't fit. These all have that. I need something more specific. So how can I narrow this down better than just my noun approach? What is it that I'm trying to say about this autobiographer, these autobiographies? What is it that my noun approach is missing? Okay, so these Latina autobiographies contributed to the genre, right, through their innovation. Hey, let's see if that's enough to narrow it down. Let's see. A, certain Latina writers who formerly wrote mostly poetry and fiction. Did they do that? I'm going to defer on that. I don't have to decide if each of these people formerly wrote mostly poetry and fiction. I don't care right now. Have found that through experimentation, the genre of autobiography suits their artistic purposes. I can get rid of it right there. It's not talking about how innovative they were or how they've helped the genre. It's just saying that it worked out for them. They've made the switch. So this may be true. Maybe if I dig in there, I'll find that all of these women initially were writing mostly poetry and fiction, but I don't need to decide that. That's one of the things I'm saying about saving yourself time. Don't just be right efficiently. B, Latina autobiographers writing in the late 1980s. If I'm not sure if it was all in the late 1980s, I think I can be right. But again, I don't necessarily care about that right now. I'll come back to it if I need to. Set aside some standard conventions of autobiography and attempt to make the genre more suitable. Okay, so I know they set aside some conventions. Did anyone struggle with the second half in an effort to make the genre more suitable? Liz, I know you mentioned that in your prediction. Mariana, you're like, no, that was fine, right? It's in the last paragraph. Cool. So if I hadn't thought of that, I would leave B and say, I don't know if they did it for that reason. Sometimes the way they'll trick us with an answer is they'll say that something had an effect in the passage, and then the answer, they'll make it look like that was intentional, right? Think of the difference between, my humming while I read annoys you versus I hum while I read in order to annoy you, right? There's that intention that maybe isn't there. So do we know that they intentionally change conventions to make things more suitable? If we dig in, yes, we do, right? We do know that, right? That's up here. To make it more amenable, they love to rephrase. Amenable and suitable are fairly good matches for each other in this context, but they love to use different words to see if they can throw us off. But if we didn't see that, we could defer on it. There's a great diversity of styles and narrative strategies. Yeah, great diversity, wonderful. We've got traditional and non-traditional. I don't know anything about that, but also just great diversity, it's not enough. It's not making enough of a point. It's not making a statement. They made a contribution. They were innovative. It's not just that they were diverse. You can be diverse without being innovative, right? There are lots of kinds of old-fashioned poetry or something. Doesn't mean you're innovating. What's wrong with D? Because D sounds very good to me in that the non-fictional narrative is combined with other genres like poetry. I feel like they said that. What's wrong with D? No one picked E, right? Prompted some critics to, to acknowledge the differences. I'm sure this is all true, that differences in gender and ethnicity may underlie differences in writing style. I mean, at least someone could think that, right? You can develop your own theory on that, but they don't emphasize that, right? What's wrong with experimentation? If they're revolutionizing the genre and changing and pushing against the forms, isn't it fair to say they're experimenting? Oh, I see. So you're reading it kind of judgy, like, oh, they're experimenting, they're like dabbling in autobiography. But couldn't it also mean that when they're writing their autobiographies, they're using experimentation with the form? Yeah, so what's interesting is I'm seeing some people say it's too broad and some people too narrow, and I think those are two sides of the same coin, right? Let's say that instead of saying this is about Latina autobiographies, I say that it's about I don't know, the the way that Latina writers use language. So in one sense, that's too narrow because I'm not just talking about how they use language. On the other hand, it's too broad because I'm not just talking about writers, and I'm not talking about writers in general. I'm only talking about autobiographies. So we've got kind of the same thing here. On the one hand, the they're not necessarily making a general point about nonfiction. They're only really talking about what they've done for autobiography in specific. So maybe we already knew that nonfiction could be combined with other genres, right? So in that sense, we could see that that's too broad a statement. The other way we could see it as too narrow is that effectively combining is nice, that's true, but it's not the main point, right? So it's too narrow, right? Not just about mixing genres, although that happens. And it's too broad because it's only about autobiography, not all nonfiction. And so that's kind of a tricky thing about main point compared to other things. Notice that neither of those would disqualify D as an inference answer. Have they shown that in nonfiction you can mix genres? Yes, because if you can mix genres in autobiography, then there's at least one part of nonfiction where you can mix genres, right? Since autobiography is nonfiction. Did they mix genres? Yes, they did, right? So they did do it, right? So the things that I'm crossing out in red and D aren't things that aren't there, but they're not the point. They don't show the scope of the point, right? Which leaves us with B. So Lottie got this right. That's great. I think this is one of the harder main point questions simply because at a first glance, it might all blur together and you have to really dig in and catch those details. And if you did that, then well done. So again, if you want to try the rest of this, you definitely can check out Prep Test 65. I'm also hoping to do more workshops on speed strategies in the future to fill this in on logic games, on logical reasoning, and eventually all of these will be up on YouTube, so you can check out my other ones under the speed strategies heading. If you want to check out one of our classes, then definitely check out our site for that. And I will put back up the speed strategies while people are wrapping up here. If you have questions for me, definitely let me know. Otherwise, best of luck with your studies and with your test, and I'll see you all around. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, all the videos that will be up on YouTube are under free LSAT Prep Hour. So as of this date, September 13th, neither of my speed strategies videos is on the site, but hopefully by the time people are watching this, they both will be up. So you can check those out. And we have other videos already up of mine and other of my colleagues, just if you Google Manhattan Prep free LSAT Prep Hour. All right, everybody, thanks very much. Hope all goes well for you. Have a great night.